Yeah. So big hello to all the viewers. Welcome again to the D-Life In channel. I am Shashikant Iyengar, the host today again. So I am a D-Life In premium member and also volunteer. For all those watching this program, this is not a medical or nutrition advice. It's a sharing of information. People are requested to take the guidance of the doctor and or a low-carb nutritionist for any change in the present diet. There are also no financials attached to this session. All are free of cost to disseminate genuine information. So D-Life In is a community platform for low carbers. It's a platform for those suffering from diabetes, obesity, PCOS, and other metabolic disorders. So D-Life In has more than 250 success stories, and D-Life In also has more than 1,000 dishes. This is Indian low carb recipes. Now, D-Life In was founded by Anup Singh, who is an engineer from IIT. Recently, Anup Singh and D-Life has been recognized and awarded as icons of India by Outlook magazine for pioneering low carb in India. And they also recently launched a diploma in low carb nutrition for those wishing to gain additional knowledge in a more scientific and systematic way, and those wishing to help others recover from all these nutritional disorders. So today we have a very special guest. We have Tucker Goodrich. So Tucker, welcome.
Thank you, Shashi. It's an honor. Thank you for asking me to participate with your group.
So it's been a long time we wanted to have you in this platform. So I'll just briefly introduce Tucker. So Tucker Goodrich is a technology executive in a financial industry who designs, runs, and debugs complex system in high-risk environment. Areas of expertise includes risk management, system management, and cybersecurity. After experiencing some personal health crisis and realizing that solutions offered by the medical profession weren't working, or it doesn't address the root cause, he started applying the same systematic approach in research and evaluation of data to his own health issue and to determine the root causes. So his interest has focused on dietary and environmental drivers for chronic disease, including carbohydrate, wheat, and various classes of fat. Specifically, he is attempting to understand and popularize understanding of mechanisms driving the diet-derived explosion in the so-called modern chronic diseases or the disease of civilization. He is very active on Twitter as @Tucker Goodrich, and he has a blog called Yelling Stop. He's an expert advisor for a nutrition startup called Nutrita, and has been guest on numerous podcasts talking about his hypothesis on that seed oils or vegetable oils may be a big Pareto factor in causing this modern chronic diseases. So he has a lot of write-ups and lot of research done, which can be really found in net, and which we'll be putting on in the YouTube link, which are going to release shortly. So Tucker, welcome again, and welcome to India virtually.
Thank you, sir.
So have you addressed India earlier?
Do I have an interest in India earlier?
I mean,
my best friend and oldest friend in the world was born in Bombay. His father is Indian and his mother is American. And he and I grew up together in Connecticut in the United States. So Indian culture has been a part of my life. They've been almost a second family to me. So Indian culture has been a part of my life for most of my life through his family. As I explained to his aunt once upon a time, who she and my friend's uncle own a restaurant in Connecticut, an Indian restaurant, of course, that my main attraction to Rahul wasn't just that he was a good friend, but it was the food. So yes, I've had a long appreciation for India and Indian food, and what a wonderful culinary culture India has, and diverse culinary culture India has.
I think it's very, very interesting, and I think we have got the right person today on the podcast, someone who understands us. And
well, I understand a tiny little piece of India, I think.
I think you understand a lot about nutrition. And so Tucker, I was going to ask you about your background. So I think that is something which I spelled out in your introduction. So please tell us about the very, very interesting story. How come you got interested into this nutrition thing about this seed oil? And please tell us about this very interesting, background story which you had about your health recovery. We're very curious to know.
Yes. So I was, a fairly typical American guy putting on a pound a year as I was getting older, and thinking that this was the natural order of things. Until I was in my late 30s, I was on the way to work one day. I was the chief technology officer and head of, as you covered, risk systems and risk development at a large New York City hedge fund. And I discovered that I was having trouble with my vision. The peripheral vision on my right side had disappeared as I was driving down the highway. And I noticed this when a car popped in front of me out of this big blind spot I had developed over on the right side. And I looked over and realized there was an entrance ramp there with a whole stream of cars coming up that I couldn't see if I looked straight ahead. So that was rather odd, but I needed to get to the office. So I continued on my way and got into a conference call, and realized after a short period of time that I was having trouble communicating with people. People were asking me questions and I could think of the answer in my head, but I couldn't get it to come out my mouth. I later discovered this is what's known as expressive aphasia, where you are unable to communicate your thoughts. So I managed to excuse myself from the call and went to see my boss and, managed to communicate to him that I couldn't really talk. And one of our colleagues had been an emergency medical technician in a prior life and diagnosed me as being in the middle of having a stroke and packed me in his car and drove me off to the local stroke ward, which was not where the ambulance would have taken me because it wasn't the closest hospital. So I proceeded to spend the next 4 days in the stroke ward being observed by a professor of neurology and his students, his medical students, who thought I was fascinating because, as one of them explained to me, they never saw anybody my age in the stroke ward. It was always old people. So this was really exciting for me to be so distinguished at such a young age. And I got a quick education on what having a stroke means to your future health, which was a rather grim prognosis, because generally if you have one, you're going to have more until it finishes you off. So I was ultimately diagnosed with, now this left me with a speech impediment, which the neurologist was able to diagnose and which luckily with time has gone away. A minor one, nothing that really anyone but I noticed, but I noticed it quite acutely. So I got out of there and was ultimately diagnosed with having a migraine, surprisingly enough. Who knew a migraine could leave you with a speech impediment, but apparently that's the case. A couple of years later, I came down with acute diverticulitis, which acute means, well, what it meant was that I had a perforation in my colon and the contents of my colon were leaking into my abdomen. Again, at work, this time I hopped in my car, drove to see my doctor, and he diagnosed this as likely the case and told me to drive to the emergency room, which I did, which was probably not a great idea because I barely made it there. Went into the emergency room to triage. They hooked me up to a blood pressure monitor, an automatic blood pressure monitor, which promptly diagnosed me as being dead. So they brought me into the hospital and did all their tests, diagnosed me as having this perforated colon. And luckily I was able to avoid an immediate surgery for a colon resection, although I did wind up having to have that 6 months later. In the hospital, I started reading up on this condition because at this point I had learned that I had to do my own research to understand what was going on. The professor of neurology changed his diagnosis from stroke to migraine in part because of research that I had done. And he commented to me that this was the first time in his career that he had changed a diagnosis because of information presented to him by a patient. So I'm lying in the hospital looking at my phone, trying to figure out what's going on with diverticulitis. And again, it's apparently a disease That's typically found in older people. 80% of 80-year-olds have diverticulitis, and it's typically seen to commence in the population at 40 years of age. Well, I was now 2 weeks past my 40th birthday. So happy birthday to me. So I had the colon resection, which was, they removed my sigmoid colon, which is about 8 inches of the colon, which is where in Western populations, diverticulitis typically occurs. And it was not curative, as they had said it was, and I continued to have symptoms, which included passing out. I mean, there was a long litany of, by this point, hospital visits due to various maladies. So a couple of years went by, and somebody sent me a link to a PhD student by the name of Stefan Guillenet's blog, and he had done a post on the causes of dental disease. Now, I had countless cavities when I was young and had 4 teeth pulled because my jaw wasn't large enough to, contain a normal number of human teeth, which is a very common problem in the modern world. And he explained in no uncertain terms, going through the literature, that this was entirely a function of diet and not as of genetics, as I had always understood. Now, at this point, I was many years into a low sugar diet, because when I was late in high school, 18, 19 years old, my dentist had told me finally, if you don't want to keep coming to see me, you should stop eating sugar. And this was a bit of a sacrifice, as I was a major sugar bug, but I did it. And sure enough, just as he said, no more cavities. I've had one since I was 18 or 19. I've had exactly one tiny little cavity from when we got a candy bowl in the office and I started sucking on mints, and I got the cavity exactly where I would put the mint in my teeth. So I was, very amenable to this. Although I wasn't interested in diet per se, I was very amenable to this idea that you could cure problems by fixing your diet, and, had been reading labels to avoid sugar for all of those years, which didn't prevent me from getting fat and sick, but did prevent me from getting any but that one cavity, which was a godsend. So I started, reading up on this, and I was just blew my mind that it was possible that, all these health, starting with my dental health. And then as I kept reading his blog, finally one day got down to the, he had a very compelling post, which is unfortunately since removed, about skin cancer and dietary fats. And as your audience can see, I am blonde and blue-eyed and fair-skinned and have been very susceptible to sunburn for most of my life. 45 minutes out in the sun and I'm a tomato. Wasn't particularly pleasant. So one day I walked down, having read all this, one day I walked down to the end of the salad bar at the office and looked at the squeeze bottles full of salad dressings there and thought to myself, well, these have got to be full of just the cheapest, nastiest oils available to man to make it into this cafeteria, and decided right there to stop eating them. And I had also, in concert with the diverticulitis, been suffering from an irritable bowel syndrome for 16 years, the primary symptom of which was chronic diarrhea, causing me to carry a roll of toilet paper around in my backpack most of the time, especially when I was out trying to do athletic activities. And stopped the seed oils on that Friday, and 2 days later, my irritable bowel disease disappeared. So that was impressive. I've gone back and looked at the email that I sent to Stefan explaining what happened, and I was just absolutely incredulous that at the rapid recovery I saw in my health. The weight then proceeded to fall away. I tried going on a low carb diet to lose the extra 20 odd pounds that I had put on over the years, and had failed because of the carbohydrate cravings. And when I dropped the seed oils, I found that I was no longer interested. I forgot to eat any carbohydrates for a week. And we can get into what I've discovered are the, what the science has shown are the mechanisms behind my experience, because nothing that I had experienced was really what was described in the literature that was available to me at the time. And I became very interested in figuring out what had happened, because essentially what I wound up having to do, which was going on a low carb, high animal fat diet, was exactly, of course, the reverse of what we're told to do by the medical authorities. And when I explained what I was doing to my physician, his comment was, "I'm very concerned about you, that this is what you're doing." And I said, "Yes, doc, I understand. That's why I'm here. I want you to, monitor me and make sure that I'm not killing myself. But it seems to me that I'm getting better fast, and I would like to understand what's going on here." So that was really when I started, getting into this whole diet and nutrition thing. It was not by choice by any stretch of the imagination. I followed the dietary guidelines here in the United States, and referred to myself to my children as Mr. Whole Wheat. So it was an interesting journey. And then as I've learned more and more and more and realized what a disconnect there is, I've sort of made it, I guess one could call it a mission to try and spread what I've learned to, the benefit of as anybody who will listen effectively.
So I think your first success you got is when you got off oil, and immediately you saw sunburn going off, or you're not getting
Yes.
sunburn. And
I didn't touch on that. That was in a couple of weeks when I started noticing a decreased susceptibility to sunburn. And the big heads up came when my now ex-wife and I went to a event in New York City in April before the leaves came out on the trees, and stood in the sun for 2.5 hours, which typically would have given me a raging sunburn. And when we got home that evening, and I hate sunscreen, so I hardly ever use sunscreen. I would just, wear hats and stay out of the sun. So we got home that afternoon, and my ex-wife came up to me and said, "Look at the burn that I got this afternoon." And at this point, I was following this diet and she was not. So I looked at her and I said, I looked at her and looked at myself in the mirror, and I said, "I didn't burn at all." Now, this is really notable because she was Colombian and was actually often mistaken for being a Asian Indian because of her dark complexion. And she would get, black hair, would get nut brown in the summer when the sun came out. And here we are doing, a parallel study, the two of us standing out there in the sun for 2.5 hours side by side. And for the first time in our life together, I had not burned and she had. And at which point she started throwing things out of the pantry. So that was a real eye opener. And, that was more than 10 years ago. And, I just recently, I was out in the sun for 6 hours skiing, here in Idaho, where I now live at 7,000 feet at pretty good altitude. And, I got pink and turned brown the next morning. No burn, no peeling, what you would expect for somebody who grows up on a planet with a sun. We should be adapted to. I mean, obviously I'm less adapted than some folks are to being out in the sun all day long, but my previous experience of 45 minutes and I would roast is rather unlikely. I didn't evolve in a cave. So
how do you attribute all these issues to seed oil? Is it not because of wheat or refined carbohydrate or whatever, the SAD diet or whatever we call standard Western diet? How is it? I mean, how do you attribute this to seed?
For my personal experience, the migraine symptoms were, and a lot of the intestinal distress was triggered by wheat. The blindness and the lack of speaking, the expressive aphasia, were clearly caused by wheat in my case. And I've had numerous subsequent incidents, always when, for whatever reason, I ate something that I wasn't aware of, that had wheat that I wasn't aware of in it. So that was definitely a component of my illnesses, but there's no pathway that I've been able to find to explain why, my sunburn experience and my irritable bowel syndrome experience, that's brought back when I inadvertently consume seed oils. I also had elevated liver enzymes consistent with, fatty liver disease, which, as I'm sure you and everybody on this group is aware, is a significant, you could call it a component or comorbidity for diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And that normalized after several years. Just one day, all of a sudden, my liver enzymes were normal for the first time in years. And there's, in the case of my sunburn experience, that article, the study by, the blog post by Stefan Guillenet talked about an article looking at a rodent model of human skin cancer, the hairless mouse model. And they basically discovered that they could dial up the rodent susceptibility to ultraviolet radiation by how much seed oils they were feeding them in their diet, right? More seed oil, more skin cancer. It turns out that seed oils in some amount are actually required in an experimental setting to induce skin cancer in an animal model. You can't induce it without, if all you use is saturated fat, they won't progress to tumors. So very clear experimental and medical evidence for my experience, supporting my experience.
So curious to know this diverticulitis, what do you attribute to? What do you think could be? That is again due to wheat, seed oil, or both, or either?
Probably both, I would say. I mean, diverticulitis is what's called variously the Western diseases of civilization, diseases of affluence. Probably calling them the diseases of civilization is the best way to put it. I read, sadly, many years ago, I read a very amusing paper by an Indian scientist complaining about calling these diseases Western diseases, since diabetes, for instance, was first described by an Indian doctor several thousand years ago, and that, it was not giving credit where it was due to call them Western diseases. So let's go. Fair enough point. Okay. Yes, I'll concede that one. And so we should call it probably the diseases of civilization. So at any rate, diverticulitis is one of these diseases and reaches an incidence of, or a prevalence of 80% in older populations in industrial countries. It's unknown in non-industrial countries, or was until, of course, they all adopted, the modern food model. And what seems to be happening there is a breakdown of the intestinal barrier, what's called the extracellular matrix. We've probably heard of leaky gut, which is another one of these side effects of diabetes, or comorbidities of diabetes. Well, a breakdown in the extracellular matrix can be caused by either wheat or seed oils through two different mechanisms. So the common explanation of diverticulitis is caused by a lack of fiber in the diet appears to be incorrect. In fact, the first treatment that they gave me in the hospital when they started feeding me again after the hole in my colon healed was what they call a low residue diet, which is a diet without any fiber, because they're concerned about the amount of pressure that this would cause. This was the common explanation. Turns out it's been known since in the medical literature, which unfortunately many doctors are not aware of, since I think it was the 70s, a British pathologist discovered that doing autopsy studies of people with diverticulitis, that diverticulitis is caused by a contraction of the muscles in the colon, which sort of like an accordion causes these pockets to form. The diverticula are the pockets in the colon. And these can become infected and perforated, as in my case. In my experience, after I had the sigmoid colon resection, where they cut out this contracted section of my colon, wheat would cause me to get cramps at the incision site. So what I think is that that's probably some combination of wheat and seed oils. Seed oils will independently induce dysbiosis in the intestinal tract. And, as some of the doctors studying diseases linked to wheat have noted, there seems to be a connection between celiac disease, which is the most extreme wheat-caused disease, and intestinal dysbiosis. So there's not a great amount of, that's a hypothesis of mine, there's not a great amount of support for that in the literature, but that was what I experienced, that in order to get the full benefit of my previously poor diet, I had to combine wheat with seed oils.
And so in your research, which are all the different diseases or disorders which are associated with seed oils or the commonly used vegetable oils?
All the chronic diseases, all the diseases of civilization.
Like, for example, diabetes,
diabetes, what are again called the Western diseases, which are liver cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer. I think I'm missing one or two there. Heart disease.
Yeah.
Up until the 20th century in most countries was a very rare disease. It's not well recognized, as was, of course, diabetes and obesity. And fatty liver disease, which is, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, wasn't known to exist prior to, say, the 1960s, the 1970s. In the United States, we're experiencing an epidemic of connective tissue failures, I would call it. So the osteoarthritis, and also things like ACL tears, which was first described in the medical literature in the 1960s, surprisingly, in the football program at the West Point, the American Military Institute, which had been playing football for 100 years. And all of a sudden they started getting ACL tears in the 1960s. Now an ACL tear is one of the most common childhood injuries here in the United States, whereas it was virtually unheard of in the 1960s. How does that happen? And again, going back to the scientific literature, there's, clear demonstrations that seed oils in the diet causes a change in the composition of your cartilage, and the breakdown of the fats and seed oils in your cartilage cause the degradation of the extracellular matrix and the induction of fibrosis, which are all the symptoms of osteoarthritis.
Can you brief? We have also read that these oils also, they damage the mitochondria. Maybe they disturb the electron chain transport. So just briefly, I know this is going to be too scientific. This is going to be too scientific for a layperson to understand. But if you can compress it in a short manner that people can understand.
Yeah. So one of the symptoms that's almost universally seen in the diseases of civilization is what's known as mitochondrial dysfunction, right? Now, your mitochondria are just to, hit high school biology briefly, are the power source for your cells, right? That's what converts energy sources like carbohydrates or fat into usable energy in the body. So they're extremely important. We can't live without them. We would all be bacteria without mitochondria, effectively. So what happens, there's a wonderful study demonstrating this by a Canadian researcher named Sanjoy Ghosh, who showed that in a mouse model, which really very well recapitulates what I think is the entire pathology here, if you fed mice the regular mouse diet, which is a high carb diet, they would be fine in their usual lab mouse way. If you added in polyunsaturated fat, seed oils, they would get fat. They would get the mouse version of diabetic, insulin resistant, and leptin resistant. And if you then added in hyperglycemia, and their mitochondria would start to malfunction. And if you added in hyperglycemia, which mice don't naturally get the way humans do with diabetes, this would cause their mitochondria to collapse and lose the ability to use glucose as a fuel. This induced heart failure, another disease of civilization that we're seeing an epidemic of, which is heart failure, where your heart is unable to generate enough energy to continue pumping as it should. And this is, in humans, accompanied by mitochondrial dysfunction, which seems to be directly induced by the combination of seed oils and the resultant hyperglycemia. This heart failure is what my father passed away from last September. So this is something that, I paid a lot of attention to.
And what I wanted to ask was, what happens when seed oils are heated to a high temperature? No, we'll just address that later on. The earlier question was,
Okay.
what about this linoleic acid and omega-3 ratio to omega-6 ratio? So what can you tell us about these few things?
Yes. So not all fats are the same. We've all heard of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fats. For polyunsaturated fats, there are two different types, the omega-6 and the omega-3. Those names derive from the structure of the fats, and we won't go into that here because it's not really important to know to understand this. The primary fat in seed oils is an omega-6 fat, linoleic acid, which is an 18 carbon chain fat with two missing hydrogen atoms, which is why it's called polyunsaturated. Saturated refers to how many hydrogen atoms a fat contains. Now, these missing hydrogen atoms make this fat susceptible to oxidative damage. And when it is oxidized fat is a rancid fat, right? So we all know that rancid fats have gone bad and are not suitable for consumption. Linoleic acid is extremely, like all polyunsaturated fatty acids, is extremely susceptible to rancidity, and especially when it's heated, used as a cooking oil. Omega-3 fats are also so susceptible, but humans are very good at detecting rancid omega-3 fats, right? That's what makes fish smell bad when they go bad, and we find it a repulsive smell. Unfortunately, with omega-6 fats, humans don't find rancid omega-6 fats to be repulsive. The smell is a little stale, and some people actually prefer it, oddly enough. However, rancid omega-6 fats are far more toxic to humans than rancid omega-3 fats are. And in the modern diet, we consume, enormous amounts of omega-6 fats compared to our evolutionary expectations, and less omega-3 fats typically than our bodies evolved to expect. So now, what's interestingly, you mentioned in our discussion, Chris Kenobi, who's an ophthalmologist, he's done a good deal of talking about the eye consequences, the consequences to our eyes of an excess omega-6 intake. Age-related macular degeneration, which is a common comorbidity of diabetes, is caused, according to the medical literature, by an excess consumption of omega-6 fats in the diet. And they noticed early on, I wrote my first post about that in 2011, I think. And the literature was quite clear. They discovered that if you tried to eat more omega-3 fats, it had no protective effect on your propensity for age-related macular degeneration. But if you had a low omega-6 intake, that was protective, right? So it seems that eating more omega-3 fats is protective against some aspects of diseases of civilization, particularly obesity. But it doesn't appear to be protective against all of them. And probably the best model for that is the Japanese, who since the end of World War II have increased their intake of seed oils dramatically. and also eat a lot of fish, obviously. So get quite a lot of omega-3 fats. They have a fairly high rate of diabetes, but a fairly low rate of obesity. And comparing them to the Chinese, who are genetically fairly similar, the Chinese now have one of the highest childhood obesity rates in the world. And it's probably based on the animal experience because of the lower rates of omega-3 fats that they consume. Those are shown in animal models to be directly protective against seed oil-induced obesity.
So what do you conclude that in this short discussion about this omega-3 and omega-6? Is it worth raising omega-3 intake significantly, or is it worth reducing omega-6 significantly? How is it?
Well, nobody really eats too much omega-3. I mean, there's some indication that if you're an alcoholic and you're guzzling seed oils, or sorry, fish oil, that's really bad. But, you know, I mean, the Japanese are one of the longest lived populations in the world. And other populations that ate a lot of fish, like, you know, the Eskimos or Inuit, were quite healthy before they were introduced to the, you know, what I like to call the modern American diet, since America played a rather unique role in spreading industrial seed oils around the world. I think we deserve a fair amount of the blame for it. But, you know, reducing your consumption of omega-6 fats, I came across a very interesting paper looking at Indians on an 80% carbohydrate diet, and they had the various seed oil consumption. Then they switched them to, you know, some of the people in this study switched to canola oil, and then some of them switched to olive oil. And as they did so, their insulin resistance went down, right? So the variable in those three oils was the declining ratio of omega-6 fats in the oils, right? Traditional Indian cooking oils, like most seed oils, tend to be pretty high, and canola oil is kind of a moderate level, and then olive oil can be quite low in seed oils. So there are several human studies showing that simply reducing omega-6 intake without reducing carbohydrate intake will cause a reduction in insulin resistance. And in fact, the model used here in the United States to induce insulin resistance in humans is to inject soybean oil, a seed oil, into their veins, and bingo, they get insulin resistance.
Something which we never knew. It's a very good point you told. We never knew that injecting soybean oil can actually cause insulin resistance, and it's a very good important point. And you know,
again, this is something that's been known in the medical literature for decades, right?
I think we may not know.
Yes.
So again, I will say, let us safely conclude that, you know, reducing the omega-6 fatty acids or reducing the seed oil has significant benefits, and then increasing, let us say, you know, at India level, you know, maybe a little more saturated fats like butter, ghee will be of more useful. And you know, what is your understanding about, you know, the role of seed oils in CVD, in cardiovascular disorder? You know, how exactly it does, or what is your view on this? Yeah.
So cardiovascular disease was, you know, if you go back and look at the older medical literature in the United States and England, they discussed this rapid increase in cardiovascular disease in both countries, which to them was mystifying at the time. This occurred about the same time that seed oils were introduced into the population. I gather you had Nina Tichholz on discussing the history of seed oils. So to recap that briefly, seed oils came into the human diet through, in the United States at least, through the detoxification of cottonseed oils, which were then used to adulterate lard, which was, you know, pork fat, the predominant cooking fat used in the United States back in the late 1800s. So that was when also we saw the increase in diabetes, as detailed by Gary Taubes in his book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, where it went from an extremely rare disease to quite a common disease. And, so it's epidemiologically the increase in the introduction of seed oils in an industrial level into the human diet corresponded with the increase in diabetes and cardiovascular disease and probably cancer, based on what happened in Germany, where the process of hydrogenating vegetable oils was invented. So similarly, in the 1960s, an American doctor, or I think he was actually of Korean extraction, started looking into the incidence of heart disease in various different countries, trying to figure out if there was a genetic component to it. And he looked at the Japanese, the Koreans, and Africans, African Americans versus, I think it was either Uganda or Nigeria. I should really double check that one, because but at any rate, he looked at those populations living in their native countries, eating their native diets, and then he looked at what happened to them when they moved to the United States, where, folks like me had a extremely high rate of heart disease, and the African Americans have an even higher rate of heart disease. They're probably the most susceptible here in this country to that disease. And he compared them to Africans living in Africa and discovered that, using autopsy, so a highly accurate measure of determining the rate of myocardial infarction, because a heart attack leaves scars in the heart. So you can tell in autopsy that somebody's had a heart attack. And he found the heart attack rate in Africa was zero. Now, this is also has been subsequently noted in, Harvard University published a book looking at the emergence of Western diseases. That's the title. And that doctor practiced in Africa and, discussed how African nations didn't have heart disease until they started eating, Western industrial foods. So in the 1980s, some American doctors, they were, slash scientist doctors, and they started looking into what's known as the diet heart hypothesis, that, ultimately is LDL causes, LDL is what is causing atherosclerosis and therefore ultimately heart disease. And they tried, the first step of atherosclerosis is turning a macrophage, which is a type of white blood cell, into what's called a foam cell, which is a cell that is stuffed full of fat and cholesterol. So they took LDL and incubated it with these macrophages, expecting that this would cause the macrophages to become foam cells, but it didn't work. So, oops. So that's a hypothesis that didn't pan out, that LDL causes the first step of heart disease. What they realized was that the LDL had to be modified, and they didn't really understand what this modification was, and that this modified LDL would cause the first step of atherosclerosis. So that was Doctors Brown and Goldstein. They were given the Nobel Prize a few years earlier for their discovery of the LDL receptor. So another pair of doctors, Steinberg and Whitstone, figured out what modified LDL and performed some animal experiments and experiments in humans, where they determined that it was the amount of seed oils in the diet that affected the propensity of LDL to oxidize, and oxidized seed oils in LDL are what induce the macrophages to turn into foam cells and for atherosclerosis to then progress. And one of those doctors, Steinberg, then convinced Merck, the large pharmaceutical company, to introduce the first statin disease, sorry, slip of the tongue there, statin drug. Yes? To introduce the first statin drug, which was their attempt to lower LDL and indirectly reduce the risk of oxidation that they had discovered. Now, to this day, as far as I am aware, there is no other hypothesis explaining why humans get atherosclerosis and heart disease that does not involve these oxidized N6 fats in large point. There's a lot of debate over where this oxidation happens and why it's happening, but I've not seen a single explanation that doesn't include it in some respect. Now, if you go talk to your average cardiologist, he will unfortunately be completely oblivious to this line of evidence and will just tell you to take your statin. Many of us have heard of the Mediterranean diet, which is promoted by the cardiology industry as a way to avoid heart disease. This was done. The Mediterranean diet concept had been championed by a fellow named Ansel Keys, who is the proponent that saturated fat causes heart disease. And this hypothesis was tested in the early 1990s by a French doctor, Delorgeril, and he fed people who had already had a heart attack a Mediterranean disease or a Mediterranean diet, and they reduced their rate of a second heart attack by 70% compared to the diet that was recommended by the American Heart Association, amusingly, which caused the American Heart Association to immediately change their dietary recommendations. One of the key, in light of the evidence in the cardiology literature, it's interesting to note that one of the key interventions in the Lyon diet heart study, which was Delorgeril's study, was to reduce the intake of omega-6 fats down to about 3.6% of the diet. And he did this by having people take canola oil, which, as we've seen in later studies, the one I mentioned that was done in India, reduces the rate of diabetes. Diabetes and heart disease are basically two sides of the coin. So if you have diabetes, your rate of heart disease is astronomically higher than if you don't. So I think it makes sense to see those as sort of linked diseases, two sides of one coin. So the most successful heart risk reduction trial that we have, one of the key components of it seems to have been that it reduced the intake of omega-6 fats, which is, entirely consistent with the mechanistic explanation of why heart disease is happening in humans.
So Tucker, what happens when these seed oils are heated at a high temperature? What exactly happens? I think many people are very curious to know what happens.
Yeah, so in 1987, the New York Times published an article about, turns out that in China, there were a lot of Chinese women who'd never smoked who were coming down with lung cancer. And the cause was that they were cooking with seed oils, right? It turns out that seed oils, when heated, break down into toxins the same way they do in your body, although a lot faster. One of these toxins is a chemical called acrolein, which happens to be one of the major toxins in cigarette smoke. So seed oils are, done a great deal of research since then. Seed oils are pretty clearly a major possible cause or major potential cause of lung cancer in humans. You don't just have to smoke, you can cook with them. And this has been seen in American, kitchen workers, where seed oils are now the major commercial cooking fat that's used around the world, and especially here in the United States. So these toxins cause a variety of ill effects. The leading explanation at the moment for colon cancer is oxidation of these omega-6 fats, which causes a particular genetic mutation that's seen in 50% of all cancer cells, which is a mutation of the p53 gene, which is known as the cancer protection gene. So there are, 3 different types of cancer that I'm aware of where seed oils are required for experimental induction of it. And this cancer gene mutation, the damaging of the cancer gene, is preferentially caused by a seed oil oxidative product called HNA, which is one of the things that a heated seed oil breaks down to, or this also happens in your body in the mitochondria. So yes, they rapidly become, toxic, which is there are papers that one can find in the oil industry detailing the toxins that are produced by cooking. For instance, there's one amusing paper looking at what happens when you fry potatoes in seed oils, and noting the rapid increase in these toxins, and noting the potential health problems that this could pose to humans. Sadly, even the Harvard School, the Harvard School of Public Health, which is the preeminent, one of the preeminent public health institutions in the world, they actually recommend that you eat vegetable oils for your health. Oddly enough, they recommend against eating fried foods, noting that they are, thought to cause heart disease. How they can't recognize that everybody is frying their foods in vegetable oils now, and that they're well known in the industrial literature to convert into toxins that are, the same toxins that were recognized back in the 1980s as being necessary to induce the first step of atherosclerosis. Yet they keep recommending them. But we should get from that point at some point into, what, ghee and butter, and what should you be cooking with instead. But at any rate, I just want to highlight that aspect.
So, see, people feel that we can eat anything and get away with it. We can exercise and get it burnt. So, I'm very curious to know: can this linoleic acid be accumulated in human body? If so, how much? And can we burn it off as energy? This is a very curious question, which I have, and which I'm sure that our population will definitely benefit if you address this.
It's an excellent question. Even the oh dear, I can't remember his name, but the Indian doctor who first described diabetes.
Malhotra. Okay.
No.
Shushruta.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. 2,000 odd years ago, his recommendation was to exercise. And exercise ameliorates the negative effect of diabetes. It also allows you to better oxidize fats. And interestingly, a ketogenic diet in rodent models allows the rodents to burn off the toxins that are created by seed oils in their bodies. So it's, there's a clear path for a ketogenic diet to be protective against excess seed oil consumption, but it's not 100% protective, unfortunately. The rodents they use in these experiments with a seed oil-based ketogenic diet typically get, not always, but typically get liver failure further on in their lives. So that's obviously not something we're looking to induce in ourselves. So yeah, it's definitely, exercise alone induces a better ability to cope with what's known in the scientific literature as oxidative stress, which is effectively the process of these seed oils breaking down into toxins in your body. So yeah, but it's not 100% protection. So yes, by all means, exercise will make it better. It's hugely, there's nothing more protective than exercise against poor health, including every one of the diseases of civilization. But what I'm interested in is not a 50% reduction in heart disease risk, but why, did we all several generations ago have a close to zero risk of heart disease? That's where I'd like to be. So yes, it's right.
So now the most awaited questions, which all of us will be curious to know, is some of our traditional cooking fat. We have been using ghee, butter, and now more recently, maybe in the past history, we have been using cold pressed groundnut or peanut oil, sesame oil, and mustard oil. So we are curious to know, are these three oils okay to use? Mustard oil, seed oil, and groundnut oil. What is your view?
They are all problematic, and they are probably why diabetes emerged first, it seems, in India, because of the Indian consumption of seed oils from time immemorial. Now it's interesting. There's an American doctor, another cardiologist, Dariush Mozaffarian, who's a public health epidemiologist at Tufts University, and he's one of the primary producers of pro-vegetable oil research here in the United States, and which is subsidized by the, not surprisingly, vegetable oil industry. He has actually, if you want a wonderful demonstration of the idiocy of the American patent system, he has actually patented a fat found in dairy fat as being protective against diabetes and heart disease. Right? How one, back to credit where it's due, how one patents a fat that has been used in human cooking for uncounted thousands of years is a bit of a mystery to me. But it's really interesting that this same fellow who promotes seed oil consumption is also pointing out that dairy fats are protective against these diseases, which has been known in the Indian medical literature since the 1960s, sadly ignored by the world. So, yeah, I think that the consumption of seed oils in India is very problematic, and is why, Indian populations have been noted. There were some papers published in Africa, I think in the 60s, in South Africa, looking at the Indian population there, comparing them to the other populations, noting that the Indian population had the highest rates of heart disease. And based on what we know about the mechanisms, I would expect that, the longstanding consumption of seed oils in Indian cuisine is a bit of an issue, but would have been up until the modern era offset to some extent by Indian consumption of ghee and other dairy products. Sadly, the American obsession with saturated fat has been effective in India as it has been everywhere else in decreasing, from my understanding, consumption of traditional cooking fats and replacing them with industrial seed oils. So,
and I think this is amply demonstrated even in that Indian study, the Indian railway study, Malhotra, where he has compared
yes,
northern and southern. Northern people have more of saturated fat or fat from dairy, whereas from southern part they were having more of seed oils, groundnut oil and sesame oil.
yes. Now,
Yeah.
Dr. Malhotra did some of the most interesting epidemiological studies in the literature back in the 1960s, when Ansel Keys was trying to scare everybody out of eating dairy fat. Dr. Malhotra was the head of the Indian railway system, medical system, which was, apparently a wide variety of hospitals all across India that employees and their families of the Indian railroad system would go to. So he had 1.15 million patients and detailed and careful medical records that he was able to review. And he had a variety of really fascinating papers, actually. One of the most, the relevant one here is titled, just a second, Epidemiology of Ischemic Heart Disease, which is, heart disease caused by clots, basically, heart attacks caused by clots in India, with special reference to causation. And he was listening to these, American and European doctors who were claiming that saturated fat was the cause of heart disease. And he looked at the Indian populations under his care, and he said, our data, however, do not support this association of high fat intake with the liability to develop ischemic heart disease, because while in the north, the consumption of fats, most of which are animal fats, is 19 times more than in the south, the disease is 7 times less in the north than in the south. Moreover, while the milk fats eaten in the north have a preponderance of saturated fatty acids, the seed oils used in the south are mainly composed of unsaturated fatty acids. this inverse association is noteworthy, especially because others have also observed this association of high intake of animal fats and freedom from cardiovascular disease. Now, it's only taken us in America up until the relatively recently to come to the conclusion that Malhotra was right, as we now have a preponderance of evidence showing that a good intake of full-fat dairy is protective against cardiovascular disease, such that folks in the public health community are starting to talk about what a big mistake the whole campaign against saturated fat was. Meanwhile, unfortunately, our dietary guidelines are still, ignoring this evidence and ignoring the evidence that Malhotra presented back in the 1960s and recommending that we avoid full-fat dairy and eat seed oils, while, Mozaffarian and Harvard University are patenting dairy fats as protective against these diseases. So one can observe all this evidence and draw your own conclusions about what you ought to do in your own diet. But I know for me, it's quite clear. I've got full-fat pastured cream here in my coffee in the morning. Cheers,
I think
everyone.
this is one study which sadly very few people in India know. In India, probably the low carbers, and across the world, all the low carbers, they appreciate this study. So see, we could have conversation going on and on. I know you can talk for 8 hours on this. So what we'll do is now, this is so interesting. There are so much questions which are passed on to, which I'm not touching because of time. I think it's already 1 hour. So what I'll do is I'll open up for Okay,
before we do that, I'd like to make one point. There is evidence that if you are diabetic with the associated comorbidities like fatty liver disease, that you can go on a low seed oil diet and get better even while not reducing your carbohydrate consumption. The fastest way to do it is absolutely to go on a low carbohydrate, low seed oil diet, right? If you are looking to fix your disease, that is the best recommendation. However, for a country like India, India is not going to become a low carb country at any point in the near future, right? Simple fact. So I think this is an important message to take away, that since these fats have been shown to be better for people in a country of like India or many other Asian countries, or many countries with a high carbohydrate consumption, I think really what we need to be looking to do is reduce the consumption of seed oils and increase the consumption of traditional fats like dairy fats that are now understood to be healthy and protective against these diseases.
I think this is one recommendation even I give it to my family and friends. I know that they will not adopt low carb. I just tell them, please change your cooking medium. These seed oils are very good for oiling, your hinges, and and they look very good in a supermarket shelf. That's all. Don't pick it up.
They make a lovely biodiesel too.
Yeah. So the small thing which people can do is just change their oil. That's all. And I'm unmuting everyone, so people can ask their question. They are very curious to know how good is coconut oil. This is one question has come. So
yes, coconut oil is the healthy seed oil. It has a very low omega-6 fat content, and it has lots of medium chain fats, which your body really likes to run as fuel. There are in the South Pacific many populations that eat a lot of, their primary fat sources are coconut fat and fish, and they are, they don't have cardiovascular disease or diabetes. So I think, while I do think there are benefits to including dairy fat, I think coconut fat's a very healthy fat.
And I think, what I'll say, it is not a seed oil. In fact, it's a fruit oil. And
well, we can debate over what a coconut is, but the important thing to know is that coconut oil is, yes, that's right.
Yeah, there's one more question here, and people can ask question if it is razor sharp. I'll prefer that people not make statements rather than ask questions.
Hi, Krishi.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, this is Deepak.
Hi, yeah,
Just
Deepak.
like coconut oil, what about olive oil? Is that considered a seed oil or is it?
No, it's safe. Yeah.
Olive oil is a fruit oil. It's made from the soft outer part of the olive, not the pit of the olive, which is the seed. The problem with olive oil is that there's a wide natural variation in the amount of omega-6 fats in olive oil. It can go anywhere from 2%, which I would say is excellent, to 22%, which I would say is not so great. And there's really no way to know what you're getting. So, certainly olive oil is a better choice than any of the other seed oils. They've also, something we didn't touch on, industry is well aware of the problems with omega-6 fats. And they've put a big effort into producing what they call high oleic varieties of seed oils, sunflower seed, safflower seed. Those are attempting to mimic the fatty acid balance of olive oil and are certainly a better alternative if you must consume seed oils to the traditional seed oils. I mean, if you can get high oleic sunflower seed oil, that's a much better alternative than the traditional high N6 sunflower seed oil.
Deepak, your question regarding olive oil safety, let me tell you that there's a big issue of contamination. So the contamination would be, it's already a big issue even in US, and forget India where our regulations are lax. So most of them would be contaminated, one. And secondly,
adulterated, meaning they're cutting it with cheaper oils.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is a big problem. And the other thing is the variation, like pomace oil, they are just junk oil, pomace olive oil. So the best way to shift is to our traditional fat like butter, ghee, and maybe coconut oil.
Okay.
There's a question from Clive. So Deepak, hope it addresses your question.
I think it addresses, and there was a point around sunflower oil which was not very clear to me. Is it possible to clarify that, Mr. Tucker?
Yeah.
Yes. So industry is aware of the problems with these seed oils, the vegetable oil industry, and they've been attempting to, through a combination of breeding and genetically modifying these fats, make them healthier, right? There's one of my favorite titles in a industry journal on genetic modification is genetically modified soybean oil is less obesogenic than standard soybean oil. Now, this is an industry journal telling us that soybean oil is obesogenic and that this low omega-6 soybean oil is less obesogenic. By the way, the comparison fat that they used that was not obesogenic at all in that animal study was coconut oil.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, Deepak, it is best to stay off
sunflower. Okay.
It is just high in omega-6. It's just stay off.
Yeah, the high oleic varieties are better if you don't have a choice, but I would,
I don't think it is available much in India. High oleic variety.
Yes.
Okay.
What we get is the common refined bleached, or whatever we call the industrialized sunflower oil. Just absolutely plain. So the question from Clive, whether what about the seeds? So the whole seeds, do we have them? Because they may also contain omega-6. The seeds. Do we eat the seeds?
The whole seeds.
Yeah.
I mean, the benefit of nuts is, one of what I consider the toxic effects of seed oils is that it lowers LDL. It lowers your cholesterol quite reliably. There are several studies in humans that show that if you take a lot of seed oils, it will lower your LDL, but unfortunately your rate of death goes up and your rate of cardiovascular disease goes up. The benefit that's claimed for nuts is that it lowers LDL also. I would be careful about overconsumption of seeds or nuts because of the omega-6 content. I mean, I eat them as a snack and periodically, but I wouldn't make it a staple part of your diet.
So Clive, hope this addresses. So maybe a small quantity is okay, absolutely no issue. Dr. Tanmoy Das asks, can olive oil be used for deep frying?
Olive oil is very safe for deep frying, actually. It's very stable at heat because of the low content of omega-6 fats. Obviously, that'll depend on how good your olive oil is. But yeah, there are lots of papers in the literature showing that olive oil is an excellent frying fat. with the obvious caveat that any fat will go bad if you reuse it for too long, and especially if you overheat it.
Fine. How about canola oil?
Canola oil is, again, an oil that is actively being re-engineered to be lower in omega-6 fats. It's naturally lower in omega-6 fats. In the human studies, it's shown to be better than the traditional seed oils, but not quite as good as lower omega-6 fat oils like olive oil. So, I would, again, depending on what your options are, I would opt against it, but it's certainly a healthier alternative.
Fine. So canola oil, okay. Groundnut, yes, groundnut oil we already told. And there was one more question. Sneha ma'am, what was your question? I'm unable to find here.
I missed the groundnut oil. Is it okay or not?
Sesame oil. Pardon. Can you just repeat?
No. I was asking the groundnut oil. I missed the point.
Groundnut oil. So that is something which Mr. Tucker has already told. He doesn't prefer much of groundnut oil.
Sesame oil, it's for cooking, yes, it's another high omega-6 oil, so it's problematic if you're going to use it in quantity. I mean, I use it as a flavoring, but that's typically a tiny amount. So, again, the dose makes the poison is really a takeaway message here.
So the question here is, when you say groundnut oil is to be avoided, do you mean cold pressed version also, or do you mean the industrialized version? This is the question.
There's no difference between cold pressed or the industrialized versions. I mean, if it's cold pressed and you're cooking with it, you're damaging the oil, and if you're ingesting it, the oil is going to become damaged in your body. So that's a good marketing terminology, but I don't think it has any relevant distinction for health.
So it makes no difference. So any more questions we have? I think that's all. That's all I can find. If anyone has some question, they can just unmute and speak. Absolutely no issue, because I unmuted everyone.
Hi, Shashi, Kishore here.
Yeah, Kishore.
A question to Mr. Tucker.
Yeah.
So here in India, this not only in India, anywhere, this coconut oil is extracted in two different ways. One is typically it is put in a mill and the oil is extracted, and the other one is the VCO. So is the traditional extraction method, is that fine, or only the VCO we need to have it?
I'm sorry, I wasn't. What you used the term
there? VCO is virgin coconut oil. So let me explain. Yeah, I think there's one. There are a few ways. Let me just explain. One is where that white meat of coconut is crushed and it is fermented, and then the oil is extracted, cold pressed. And the other one is the dried coconut. It is just put in an expeller and taken out. So these are two versions. One is the wet coconut and one is the dry coconut. So both are cold pressed. They don't apply any heat.
Right. I don't think that the extraction method is really that relevant. What's more important is that coconut has very low levels of the fats that can be oxidized and turned into toxins, right? The exception there is, if you're overheating coconut oil or any other fat or any oil, you're going to break the oil down, right? I mean, that's what the smoke point is. But yeah, the benefit of coconut oil is that it's very low in omega-6 fats. And it really doesn't matter what your expression method is, because they have such a low level to start with that it's going to be an extremely stable fat.
And what is your view on the heat applied or heat extracted coconut oil? Is it going to make any difference? Will it be harmful? I mean, there are industries who produce this commercially. They apply heat. They use heat extraction process.
I'm not aware of a difference between the extraction methods. I mean, any fat or oil that's overheated will start to break down, but I'm sure they're aware of that in their extraction process. They don't want to damage their product.
One question here from my side. What about palm oil? I mean, see, the red palm oil or the palm kernel oil is quite good, I think, and that has more saturated fat, similar to maybe coconut oil. How about this the refined bleached deodorized one, RBD oil, palm oil. And do you have any information on this?
Yeah, palm oil.
This oil is used very commercially, and it's used a lot in India in snack foods. So
yes, palm oil and palm kernel oil, which are, you know, the equivalent of, you know, the fruit oil and the seed oil, are both, because they're tropical, and we won't go into a whole tangent onto why that is, but they are higher in saturated fat and lower in omega-6 fats than most seed oils. So are definitely a healthier alternative. And amusingly, they've, you know, started to come back as hydrogenated vegetable oils have been banned in most countries because it's, you know, a better cooking fat and probably also a healthier cooking fat.
But what about this refined, bleached, and deodorized version? Is what we get is RBD oil. They refine it, they bleach it, they deodorize. So do you think this is any healthy? You have any information on this?
I'm not aware of a difference between in the extraction methods on health.
Okay, fine. Okay, because that is the oil which is used very widely here. So that's what. So someone is asking about sesame oil. Yeah, sesame oil. What Mr. Tucker says is doesn't prefer heating it. So maybe, as you know, maybe just putting it in salad or something is what.
Well, I mean, I'll put a dash of. I have a bottle of spicy sesame seed oil in my pantry that I'll, you know, if I'm frying something, you know, if I'm making like a stir fry in butter, I'll put a dash of that in at the end of the meal because it's delicious. But, you know, it's a dash. And the cooking fat I'm using is butter. So.
Fine. So, Dr. Tanmoy Das has a suggestion for you. Why don't you write a book on seed oils?
I'm working on one. Writing a book is easier said than done, especially on a topic like this.
So maybe, you know, my one request from my side is, you know, I look forward for some information on this palm oil, especially the industrialized version, the one where it is refined, bleach, and deodorized. So maybe if you can just, you know, get into research and find it. It's very curious, and it is used very widely in India. So maybe
that's a very interesting topic.
It's going to help us. Definitely, it is in India. It's very, very widely used, and we import a lot probably from country like Malaysia.
Right. I mean, yeah, you know, palm oil is a decent oil. It obviously there are all sorts of production issues with it as far as the environment goes, but that's kind of outside the scope of this discussion. But it's certainly better than, you know, it's soybean oil, which seems to be the worst of the lot.
That's true. Fine. So I think that's all the questions ends here. And so, Mr. Tucker, what is your message to India?
My message to India is listen to yourselves, go back to your traditions. You know, these industrial oils are not good for health, and there's a lot of evidence to support that statement. And, you know, traditional Indian cooking and cooking methods are, you know, with the caveat that you can be using a bit too much of nut oils, but, you know, the ghee-based Indian cuisine is probably one of the healthiest ways that you could eat, which is, you know, I mean, there are lots of accounts of long-lived, very healthy Indian centenarians who are eating a traditional Indian diet. I think it's an excellent eating pattern, and one that doesn't, you know, that should be preserved and not abandoned. So
thanks, Mr. Tucker. So on behalf of D-Life and on behalf of India, so I thank you very much that you can come and spare this 1.5 hours and sharing your knowledge. And today, it was an honor. I really appreciate you having me on. India has been, in my researching over the years, India's been a bright light of sensible scientific research into the, much more so than America often, into the pros and cons of various different diet approaches. It's been indispensable for me. Thank you. And from D-Life, you know, especially this controversial topic of oils, you know, we have our own limitations in terms of the cost and all. So let me tell you that, you know, our research also finds out that our traditional cooking medium has always been butter and ghee, but somewhere along the line, probably due to cost issue or whatever it is, we have come down into these oils of, these mustard, peanut oil, groundnut oil, or sesame oil. So maybe, from our side, our recommendation is please use maximum ghee butter. And in case you are not able to afford too much of this, then you can go ahead and use a very small quantity of these 3 seed oils, especially the cold press version. If you cannot really, avoid this, because somewhere we have to go 50%, the path from where, people can meet us. So, this is the recommendation from D Life. Use these oils as less as possible. Don't use them to fry, and totally please avoid all these deep fried. Forget the Western snacks. Please avoid all these Indian snacks also. The samosas, the kachoris, the batata vadas, which are deep fried. And let me tell you, these are reused oil. Tucker, you may be aware of this, that we are
Yes.
those snack manufacturers, they actually keep reusing this oil. And if someone claims that he is serving humanity from 1960, then let me tell you that there will be remnants of oil which he has put in that vessel from 1960, because he never clears that. He keeps adding oil upon oil on that. So if you carbon date it, you will find it as old as, when he has opened this shop. So just to mention jokingly. So please go ahead, please avoid all these deep fried items, so that you stay away from this disease of civilization. And I thank you again, Tucker, once again. Thank you from
Thank
D-Life.
you. And thank you to your audience for giving me the time here today. Much appreciated.
Thank you.